But of course I can't in this short interview demonstrate that with respect to each different kind of evil, though I think I have done so in writing.
What about the evil of innocent suffering is Ivan's particular challenge?
Yes, well, I mean, what I was going to say, it depends on the particular circumstances in which that innocent suffering is taking place, what the justification would be. I don't think there's any one, there are different sorts of good states in the world which are suffered by which are made possible by different sorts of evil. And most of our suffering is of the innocent kind. So let's just take one example of that. And let's take a grown-up one. Let's take the case where a parent abuses a child. It's good for the parent to have responsibility for children. It's one of the greatest goods that we have in this universe. And it's a good that not merely sophisticated philosophers have, but any ordinary person has. That the whole future of a child, whether he grows up happy, well educated, well fed, depends on the parents. And this is a very, very great good. Now, if the parent is to have that good, there's got to be the risk of the suffering. God has got to allow the suffering. It may not happen. The parents may make the right choice, but he's got to allow the suffering. The question, therefore, is whether the suffering is too great for God to allow it for the sake of this good. And after all, I'll come back to that point in a minute, but after all, as human parents, we often allow our children to suffer for the sake of a greater good. We take the child to the dentist even though it's going to be an unpleasant 10 minutes for it, for the sake of the child's health. But of course, it's logic. God could give children good teeth without the need for the dentist, but we can't, and therefore we think it quite, not merely justified, but rather a good thing to allow children to suffer for the sake of some good, in this case to them, but it could be a good to someone else.
But what if there is no good for the child concerned? There is no higher good for them at all?
Coming back to that, yes.
I want you to imagine that you are the child suffering.
Yes, I'm coming back to that. Let's just take a human example to start with. I may send my daughter to a neighborhood school which she doesn't like. It won't do her any good at all, but it will do community relations good. It's normally thought that so long as I don't, as it were, send, so long as the suffering is not too awful, I'm justified in doing this. And why am I justified in doing this? Well, I'm justified in doing this because I'm her parent. I'm the source of so much good to her that I can take back some. And you remember my 4 conditions earlier. The first was that the evil should be necessary for some good. The evil of the child's suffering in our example is necessary for the good, other things, of the parent having this enormous responsibility. And given that the parent has free will, the second condition is satisfied. The parent does have this responsibility. Now, the third condition is that the parent, or in my example, God, has the right to do this. And the right arises from, in the ordinary parent's case, from the parent being the source of so much good to the child that the parent has the right to take back some of it, as it were, in the form of suffering. Now, if that's right, then God is so much more the source of so much good to us, has the right to make us suffer quite a bit, not for our own good, but for somebody else's good. And that is the case here. He gives the child life. The child will eventually grow up. This is a bad period in the child's life when the child has to suffer. But the suffering does serve a good, and it will be compensated for. It is normally compensated for by all the sorts of good things that happens to the child. But there are cases, I agree, where it may not be compensated for on this earth, in which case it has to be compensated for by life, a certain sort of right sort of life after death. It must be compensated for in the whole of the child's life, be it on this earth or be it after earth, and God clearly can do that.
So if it's not on this earth, there may be no soul making involved here and now, nothing beneficial for the individual child, and there has been, quite importantly and significantly, no consent. The child has not agreed, the child has not asked to be coming to this world, and the child has not consented to encourage others to grow through their suffering. Does that trouble you?
Well, I say, if God is going to give the child a life that is good on balance, God, as the source of that on balance good life, has the right to take some of it back so long as it remains on balance a good life, for the sake of some good. And there's no reason why, as it were, the suffering has to occur only after some good has occurred. After all, we might do an operation on a fetus these days for the benefit of some other fetus, and we don't think that's a bad thing to do so long as we give the fetus eventually a good and happy life as parents. Analogously, just blowing up the example to God, God can cause a certain amount of suffering to a child so long as on balance the life that he gives is a good life.
Is that the life for the child, though? Or
yes,
the
life of the child.
But what happens when that life of that child in the here and now is not good at all? The suffering is involved.
In the here and now, no.
And they die a miserable death.
On balance. But I say...
But many children die very
life
terrible
has to include
circumstances.
life after death.
That's crucial for your approach.
Yes,
there must be life after death.
Yes. If there are children, people whose life is on balance bad, then God has to make it on balance good, and that in virtue of his being the source of goodness justifies in allowing the child to suffer a certain amount, so long as that suffering serves a good purpose, not for the child but for somebody else. But we've been calculating, I don't think too many lives are in that situation actually, where they need a compensation after death.
Globally, is you not in danger of being a type of Western theodicy here?
I'll tell you why.
The Sudan in our recent pictures on television?
I'll tell you why. You are estimating the goodness of a life in terms of experience, whether I like it, whether I don't. And that is not only, there are other factors.
I'm intrigued as to what else you would assess the happiness or worthwhile of a life.
Worthwhile. Happiness is having happen to you what you want to have happen. And certain lives may be unhappy, but it doesn't follow from that they're not good lives. Now let's take some examples.
Yes, that's a crucial distinction, one which troubles me at the moment. So.
I'll give you to start with, of course, the example that I give at the end of that book you've got there is the God, the parable. Suppose that you're in another world before this world, and you're given a choice of two sorts of life you can have in this world. It's going to be a short life of only a few minutes, but there are two possibilities. One is that you will have a very great pleasure all by yourself, the sort of pleasure that I'm told people get from taking heroin. The alternative is that it will be a life of pain. It will be a life of childbirth. But it will have a consequence of giving rise to a child, a further child who will be happy. You won't know that it has that consequence at that time, so you will be unhappy, but your life will be greatly worthwhile because of the good which comes from it. Now, suppose before these experiences, you're given the choice of which ones you want. Now, I think any rational, good person will choose the second alternative. They will want their life to have been of use. They will think their life is good because it's of use, even though they won't know it's of use, and even though it isn't a happy life.
But surely with the mother, the analogy, because it's the switch of the analogy there that I want to question. The mother who's giving birth to a child, it's painful and intense. The body can withstand, etc., and that may have been designed by God, etc. But at the end of the day, once the baby is born, a relationship is established, a good has clearly come from it. But those who are dying of starvation and drought in the Sudan, where is the higher good there?
The goodness of a life doesn't only depend on, isn't just a matter of whether you enjoy it or not, it's a matter of whether it's useful or not, and it's good for me that my life is of use. Now,
so does that concur with this quote on God, being allowed to suffer to make possible a great good is a privilege,
yeah,
even if the privileged is forced upon you?
Yeah.
But others may consider that to be slightly morally questionable. In the extreme, morally obscene for someone to suffer so that I can benefit a third party from seeing their suffering.
Go back to my earlier parental example where I caused some child to suffer in a mild way for the sake of good to others. To make the child suffer in certain ways for the benefit of others was not wronging the child so long as I was basically, on balance, the source of good. And then you must just blow that example up in the God case. If that's right for a human parent whose ability to benefit their own children is a gift from God, and God is the source of all the good, for directly or indirectly, for all of our lives and so on, totally that, then he surely has a great deal more right to make us suffer, so long as, on balance, he provides a life that is good, remembering on balance includes life after death. Now, but I was making the point that we mustn't automatically assume that lives which look to us, when we don't take into account the great good of being of use, lives which look to us on balance bad, aren't necessarily on balance bad when you take that into account, and therefore they don't necessarily need after-death compensation. And it is a great good to be allowed to suffer for the benefit of others.
Professor Richard Swinburne, thank you so much for the interview. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.